to throw it away lightly. I think we tend just to discount it. If you listen to the discussion today, we have two spaces for representative democracy below the national level in the United States: the state and the city. I need to define democracy, state, and city. Of course, Occupy Wall Street is political. Of course, protest is political. Of course, there's many ways of having a democracy other than elections. I'm just trying to say, is there room for elections? And if so, how are we going to defend it? So we have two places for elections below the national level in the United States. The state. And here, I'm not talking about the state as an urban theoretical concept of government, whatever it turns out. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Massachusetts and California and Illinois. That's what I mean by state. And then I want to talk about the city. The word city, if you go to urban conferences, is just completely confusing to me. On one hand, a lot of people talk about the city as if it's the region. But it's not the region. There is no regional government in the United States outside of Portland. The city is also not just Boston. There are 101 cities in the Boston metropolitan area. They're all cities. So if we're trying to think about what we mean by city, I don't want us to talk about city and suburb. I want us to talk about many, many cities. Cities are elected governments. The states, by which I mean Massachusetts and Illinois, I don't want to have to define it again, are elected governments. What are the role of these kinds of institutions? I'd say in the discourse of urbanism, they have the word state in the Massachusetts sense has almost not been used at all today. The last panel used it a little. But basically, it disappears altogether. The word city has been used, I mean, up and down, but we don't really understand it as a democratic form. The problem with the city for a lot of people is that it's both too big and too small. It's too big because the real is the neighborhood, and it's too small because the real is the region or the world. But here's the problem, as I just said. There are no regional governments in the United States today. We have no, outside of Portland, Oregon, we have no elected regional government, and we have no elected neighborhood governments either. I believe in neighborhood power. I believe in regional transformation, but I want to link them to elected government. And we have to deal, I think, practically with the elected governments we have, which are city governments and state governments, and we shouldn't pretend that city lines don't matter. In America today, you cross a city line from a prosperous city to a poor city, your life changes absolutely. Absolutely. This is the design of state law, and we should pay attention to it. Now, so I'm worried about our own discourse. I'm worried about our own discourse in which elected government disappears on the local level when we talk about it. But I'm much more worried about what's happening actually in the world. We are transferring power from elected government to other things. And this is not just privatization in the sense that we're transferring power from government, city governments, to the private sector. We are. I mean, there's this whole small government, limited government, all that stuff. There is that. That's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is we are privatizing the government itself. That the government itself has become privatized in our own thinking about it. And once we go down that road, then to privatize it all the way to the private sector won't be hard. Here are some examples of what I mean. Much of services in America today are delivered by public authorities. Things like the Massachusetts Transportation Authority that runs our subways. Things like the Water and Sewer Authority that deals with the water in the metropolitan Boston area. you should know some things about these authorities. They are created by state law. They're appointed by the government. On the other hand, they're run by corporations. Like corporations, they're run by a board of directors that is designed not to be politically responsive in the way that elected governments are. We're trying to remove them from elected government. One thing about these authorities is you try to think, what space are we in? What space are we in right now? Well, we're in a city, Cambridge, and not Boston, it turns out. We're in a legislative district. We're in a congressional district. One thing about those three things is they have no relationship to each other. The city lines have no impact on the state government, and they have no impact on the national government, but an enormous amount of city power is decided by them. So it weakens cities not to have city representation at the centralized level. But we're also in many other jurisdictions. We're in a jurisdiction of public authorities. The definition of the area for the Transportation Authority and for the Water and Sewer Authority and a dozen other authorities are all different from each other. So we are in a complicated space, but this space of public authorities is not run by people who are elected, designedly so. Now, these are functional organizations. These are functional organizations. They do particular jobs like transportation. We then want to talk about public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships. What is the spatial idea of a public-private partnerships? Think about a public-private partnership as it exists in the space of a government area. You can't, can you? That's the point. First of all, who's the public? The public could be a public authority. It may not be an elected government at all. Who is the partner on the public side? We don't know quite who the partner is. Now, move to the private side. Where is the private? Now, it's true, as Gerald says, for public parks, you can kind of have a space for a public-private partnership, Central Park. But for development, when you're dealing with private investors, they could be anywhere. In fact, are everywhere. To what extent could a public-private partnership be subject to democratic accountability? Let's move on one more step. Everybody these days wants to talk about governance and not government. They always emphasize the N, right? Munt and unts. Now, why do they want to talk about governance? Because we're not interested in government anymore. Government just has a seat at the table. Other stakeholders, there's always a table. Other stakeholders are at the table. Who are they? Who are they? Well, we know that if a stakeholder table is deciding something about public policy, major corporations will be there. We know, if it's more or less organized right, that interest groups will be there. But one group of people who will not be there are ordinary citizens, one person, one vote, ordinary people participating in government policy. And if the idea is consensus, in which the public and private are supposed to come together with a consensus, in which only one seat is the public, and that may not even be the city itself, we have a situation in which you're trying to figure out what the spatiality of this is. Corporations do not have a vote in America, at least not yet. And interest groups do not have a vote in America, just not yet. So we're trying to think about what is the role of publicly elected democratic government in the making of public policy. And the answer is, the more we spread it out and get this kind of comfortable postmodern, isn't it all kind of fuzzy and interesting feeling, the less we have any spatial idea of how any electorate, any demos, any group of people could control anything about the deal they make. Now, in the last one, and several others, there's been a lot of talk about the street. Well, let me tell you something about the street. A lot of streets in the United States are now managed by business improvement districts. There are 45 business improvement districts in New York City alone. There are 15 in Philadelphia. They're all over the country. What is a business improvement district? A business improvement district is an organization created either by the city because the state allows them or by the state, run by property owners, to decide the issues of the public street. Property owners, not residents. Property owners, not tenants, not the people actually were on the job on the street. Property owners. What kind of street do property owners want? Is it the same kind of street that ordinary people who live in the neighborhood want? Is it the same kind of street that tenants want? If you organize, and we are organizing over and over again, all around the country, if we're organizing the street through business improvement districts, if we're organizing city services through public authorities, if we're organizing public decision-making through stakeholders and governance and public-private partnerships, we lose increasingly over and over again the idea of the role of democratic elected officials in the control of public policy. So, what else?
I'm ready to go to law school. I mean,
so I mean, I want to hear Richard, and I don't want to go on. And we've been talking all day, but I want to say maybe one last thing, which is there are a lot of problems with elected democracy now. A lot of problems. Our question is, do we want to fix it or abandon it? That's our question. So here are some problems. One problem is the ridiculous place of money in our electoral system. We won't discuss that now. Another problem is the complete collapse of elected officials and celebrity. We won't discuss that now. I want to talk about one last thing which you may not think of, which is the way we organize the electorate in city governments. And the way we organize electorates is this way. There are people not there who are there. And there are people there who are not there. You may find that sentence confusing. So, in order to vote in a city election, you have to be what the lawyers call domiciled. It has to be your permanent residence. I ask my students, what's your permanent residence? And they say someplace like Virginia. And they say, I haven't been there in 8 years, and I'm never going back. But that's my residence, and I vote there. These are the people who are not there, who are qualified to vote. They're qualified to vote because that's their permanent residence. I bet there's a bunch of people in this room who are actually not here, but are there for purposes of democratic control. Now, who's not there but are actually there? Well, last week, there was a woman in Norwalk, Connecticut, who was arrested for a felony. Norwalk, Connecticut turns out to be in the metropolitan area of the United States that has the greatest income inequality in the country. A big hooray for them. I mean, it's a big competition. And they won the greatest inequality in the country. Why was this woman arrested? She's homeless, and she was living in her car with her son. And she sent him to public school. And she was arrested for a felony. And what was the felony? Stealing a free education. Stealing a free education. You think, wait a minute. Where is this woman? Well, she's not in her car in the Norwalk, Connecticut, because she's not entitled, she's not there. But she's not anywhere else either, right? She's nowhere. And her children can't go to school because she lives in a car. Now, once you begin to think about people who are not there, although they're there, you have a lot of people like immigrants. Immigrants, and I'm not just talking about undocumented immigrants, people from other countries who have green cards, who live in the United States, are not entitled to vote in municipal elections. They dominate a lot of cities. They are completely not there. So I think we need to rethink the idea of democratic accountability in terms of who's there, who's not there, who's included, who's not included. And we need to think about money, and we need to think about celebrity. We need to think about democracy. I don't think we should give up electoral democracy as one of our goals. I think it is a hard-won human idea. And we should not feel comfortable when we transfer these functions elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Next up is Richard.
Gosh. Since this has been such a rich discussion all day, I'm not going to read the prepared remarks I have. I just want to touch on four themes that I think have come up today. Maybe that's a useful way at this point to think about what we take away from the discussions today. So I am going to say something about borders and boundaries, and I'm going to talk about the politics of borders. I want to say something about the design of ambiguous and borderland spaces. And I want to say something to you in a general way about public realm and public realm theory. Okay, so this is, I could never match your eloquence. So that's what you but bear with me. When I came here, I gave a lecture on edge conditions, edges between different zones of the city, between different social and economic groups, between different communities. And to be very quick in a summary about this, I distinguish between borders and boundaries. A boundary is a kind of edge which its interaction ends, and a border is a kind of edge which is more living, more active, and more interactive. This distinction between borders and boundaries is founded in biological distinction between cell walls and cell membranes. Cell wall is a container that means to hold in as much as possible. A cell wall is a complex structure in that it's both porous and resistant. That is, this is not the opposition between open and closed. It's more complicated than that. And the border condition is one in which there's a constant need to, as in the membrane, to manage what is retained, what is given out, what comes in, what goes out. This difference in edges is reflected in natural ecologies. A boundary is, like, for instance, the space that an animal like a tiger will put through its droppings to say, don't cross this is mine. Biological activity diminishes. A border is like that between water layers or in the sea, or where the sea meets the land. It's an intense area of feeding activity and of evolutionary change. In other words, borders are ecologically much more intense than boundaries. In the city, modern settlement, the distinction is between something like a gated community, which is a kind of boundary, or a wall of traffic separating a poor from a rich community, this is a boundary, and a border is something like the differences, say, that you would see in New York and 96th Street, whose south side is extremely rich, whose north side is extremely poor, Upper East Side. And the zone in between is ambiguous and unmarked. My argument in this lecture is that what's happening in modern urban development is that the boundary condition is becoming dominant. That we are living through, both in European American cities, but also in developing cities in Asia and Africa, South America, the deployment of the boundary as a way of making urban form, which leads to more and more isolation. It abets inequality, and it deprives people of the kind of social action, of social knowledge of each other, which would make for a society in which people who are different are capable of living together. The knowledge, the experience of being with people unlike oneself is sealed at the boundary. So this is the broad context in why I'm worried about edge conditions, because we are living in an era in which the deadly edge, the death-dealing edge, is becoming the dominant form of organizing cities. I want to say something about what kind of politics marks a border condition. And here I think we're going to disagree a bit, because what I would say that happens in border conditions is that the issue of mutual and self-governance comes to the fore, rather than the issue of the formalization of belief and will. And I'm trying to give you an example of that. I think many of you have worked here on I think you've had a lot of experience of the conditions in Beirut. Is he still teaching that course? Hashem Sarkis? Is he still keep teaching the course? Yeah. Yeah, but not here. Beirut is the Green Line in Beirut is a classic instance of a borderland. It's where, after 14 years of civil war between Christians and Muslims, a space in the mutual civil war in the city, a space opened up which was, it's green because vegetation grew up in this line of conflict. After the Civil War ended, the question was what to do with the Green Line. And the planning that was involved, and I had a small amount to do with that, was to set up to try and make a politics out of the border condition. And what that meant was that it was basically a set of market stalls stretched along this place with these bombshells and blasted out buildings in between them, in which people could every day relitigate the spaces of separation between them. The border constantly shifted. Somebody one day would, a Christian stall, would feel a little uncomfortable about the person who had come next to them and would move away. It was a kind of shifting scene, or I like the word litigation about this, because there's a constant process of renegotiating who's where and the relations between them. All border politics of self-governance have this quality of relitigation. Saskia used yesterday the phrase incomplete form to describe something like this febrile making of borderland space. Perhaps, Saskia, the word incomplete is not as useful as the notion of unclosed form. That is, the form is not defined. There is a possibility for revision, for relitigation of what happens in a borderland space. We can, or later, I could see this now. Oh. What have I gotten myself into? It's a modest criticism. It's only because you grew up speaking Dutch that I bring this up. But the point I want to make about this is that borderline politics are the capacity to be relitigated means they're also very unstable. When you look in cities, say, around the Mediterranean, which have had long-term mixtures of different communities living together for centuries, and suddenly go up in flames, Smyrna, Alexandria, Beirut, of course. The surprising thing to outsiders is that these people who have lived so long together suddenly are at each other's throats. And that is a quality, I would say, of experience at the border. It's fragile. We always think about long-term association as creating a kind of stabilizing effect. But in my view, this is rather infantile, that this is extremely demanding work, and at any time a borderland space of this mutual self-governance can implode, which is a way of thinking about form as something. When we use the word form, we often think about the association of formal as permanent. And that, with the politics of the border, cannot be. It's a fragile achievement. Another aspect of politics in this borderland zone, and here, Saskia, I thought your word was absolutely correct, was that it depends, maybe we'll see where this goes tonight, just over the first chord, is that it depends on presence. That is, the awareness of the presence of others. And here is where the third little issue I'd like to mention, the third large issue I'd like to mention too, comes in. I don't think that the sense of presence, that is, of being aware of the other, is something that is limited to the spontaneous realm. I think we can design presence. You had an example of this morning, which may seem to you very trivial, when Rod described to you the chamfering of the edges of his pools. To me, this was I talked to him many times about this. The notion of cutting off a right angle, like that, chamfering an edge so that it's this way, is full of implication for how we go about, it's a technique for how we go about, and one of many, for how we design presence. It's something I was involved in working on Sarajevo, on the redesign of Sarajevo after its civil war. I don't know why. I guess because I'm such a sweetheart that people ask me to do this kind of reconstructive work. People were terrified of what literally lay around the corner from each other. And the design, to make that sense of presence less threatening we did, is we tried to remove buildings at corners so that all the edges were chamfered. You saw another example of that, although one not based on violence, in Rahul's, where is he? When Rahul showed the Charles Correa plan for housing, in which there's a constant sense of being able to see what's ahead of you, what's around you, they're not closed spaces in that. It's another form of chamfering. I just bring this up because I think oftentimes we equate the notion of this borderland condition with something that's spontaneous. And it's not. A borderland can be designed. And we have many, many ways there are many tools in the armory for designing informal spaces. And it's something we should talk about with the Boston Government Plaza. I don't see much consciousness of the relationship between informality and formality in the discussion that we've had, but maybe we can get into that. I want to say one other thing about presence, because it takes me into the thing I really would like to end these brief comments to you about, which is that presence is a sensate condition. It's a bodily condition, particularly in cities. The experience we have of the other in cities is usually not verbal. It's corporeal. It's true that 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, if you lived in pre-revolutionary Paris, when one stranger came up to another, in order to indicate that that stranger was, if 2 people met on the street, there was a sort of code where you would grab the forearm of the other person in order to speak to them. If I came up to any of you as strangers on the street today and grabbed your forearm and said, "I'd like to talk to you," you know what you'd be doing. You'd be running for the exit or using one of those little high volume whistles. The point about this is that what's the discursive realm is not really a realm for presence for us. It's a different kind of realm, mostly visual and non-tactile. And that takes me to the 4th thing I want to talk to you about, which is public realm theory. Because in the debates about public realm theory, the difference between a discursive public realm and a non-discursive corporeal realm have divided it's been a huge argument in the social sciences and in social thought. On one side of this debate lies the theories of public realm of Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas. Those theories are not quite the same. For Habermas, a public realm means discussion of self-interest and prior history with strangers. That is, the particularities, the identities of a person are brought into public and discussed with people who are strangers. For Arendt, when you go into public, you leave your selfhood, as she famously put it in Human Condition, behind. That is, you have a discussion which is not based on self-reference. But for both Habermas and for Arendt, essentially what the public sphere is about is a sphere of discourse. In my view, that's not an urban sphere. And the school that I belong to, which is, includes anthropologists like Clifford Geertz, in some ways the sociologist Irving Goffman, myself, has emphasized the public sphere as being constituted by bodily expression to people to whom one doesn't speak. And it's modeled on the theater, if you like, about bodily gesture, about regard, about the framing of public spaces, and so on. It is a public sphere which is suited to thinking about the design of cities. But it's not suited to thinking about the kinds of exchanges which lead to democratic politics. That's its limit. So what I would say to you about this is that since publicness was the title of what we're thinking about here, that what Jerry has taken us back to is a notion of the public sphere which actually takes us away from the making of public space, which is bad. But what the makers of public space, like myself, and I've been part of this group of what are called dramaturgical public theory. You don't want to know about the details of how that works internally. But what we are better at doing is thinking about those corporeal, mostly visual, forms of creating expressive public space, and particularly through performative, informal performative means in this borderland condition. And what's the limit on this is that it is presence, but it sacrifices politics. So that's how this great drama, in my view, of publicness is played out. And that's why we've gone around the world having these discussions about this. It's an irresolvable conflict in what we mean about the public realm, I think. It's a question, if you like, about the design of the city versus the design of the polity. And those are two very, very different notions in social theory as in practice about the public realm. So maybe we stop. Please wrap up. I've wrapped up.
Okay.
So here's what I propose. Let's take 10 or 15 minutes and direct questions at Jerry and Richard, and then we probably have another 20 minutes after that for a general set of comments. Okay. So it's about 5:25. We're going to go till 6. That's our plan. So what I propose is let's collect a bunch of questions. We'll turn it back over to the panel, and maybe we can do that 2 rounds. And if you could kindly identify yourself so that they know who you are. Who wants to start? I thought I saw a hand on this side. Yes, Bish.
I want to ask you a question to Jerry. This is Bish Sanyal from Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. I want you to reflect back on the relationship between democracy and capitalism, because your presentation was all in the democratic form, and you know that the whole literature is based on the relationship between the two. And what struck me listening to you was that relationship spatially, when it was formulated, was based on the nation state. So you look at this level of the city. So for you to say, well, we're going to make it some changes on the democratic system to make it better, let's talk about the relationship. Where do you want to intervene?
Thank you, Bish. You want on this side? Yes.
I'm Ben Bolger. I'm an alum of the GSD. I was fascinated by your discussion of voting and kind of being in different places and having different identities. There's kind of more complexity to that. There's people that own multiple residences, Michigan, Montana, Massachusetts, and yet are forced to choose between the property that they own as homes. There's also people that happen to sleep in Rhode Island or New Hampshire, but work and live and spend most of their life in Boston or New Jersey and Connecticut, but happen to work in New York City. So I'm wondering about the idea of kind of multiple political identities that are expressed in a way that better recognizes that changing phenomenon.
Okay, let's maybe take 1 or 2 more. Who else? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Svetlana Boym, and I admired your dialogue very much, but I am somewhat troubled by the ending of Richard Sennett's presentation about incommensurability between public and political. And I want to refer back to Hannah Arendt, who I don't think presents solely discursive version of public sphere, but in fact tries to relate political back to public. So I want to give a few counterexamples, and maybe I would like you to think positive, so to speak, at the end of the day, of a few counterexamples. I mean, one I could think of is like Bogota, Antanas Mokus project, which is a kind of performative and political, or Tirana, Albania, Edi Rama project of transformation of the city. Or I hope like some urban protests all over the world have a relationship to the political. So I really would like to think interconnection, and maybe going back to Hannah Arendt, but just not giving up with incommensurability there. With this, I want this to be a boundary, a border, and not a boundary.
Thank you, Svetlana. And let's take one more from the back.
Yes. Well, I appreciate this conference. My name is George Kelso, a graduate of the school. I greatly appreciate this conference. It's really been excellent. My question is, you know, I've always appreciated London, and then I found out that, and what I appreciated most about London, I think, was the House of Parliament, because when I went through it, I found the experience was almost at the level of sophistication, almost sacred as the great cathedrals. And then I find out that one of the leaders that brought the level of the rebuilding of the House of Parliament to that high level of design was under the leadership of Winston Churchill. His quote, "We shape our buildings and they have to shape us." I also found out that he was a great artist. He was tremendous. So I was also surprised that I searched through the great internet that I could not find any real concrete information on how he persuaded the House of Parliament to do the funding and hire the architects to provide that kind of
We haven't
leadership.
really talked about
That is my question. Is,
well, that's
how did Winston Churchill do it?
Oh,
Okay, great.
okay.
So turn it back over to you. Who wants to go first?
Well, let me say something about this dichotomy, which shouldn't exist, of course. Of course, it should be a borderland. I think in practice, it's more of a boundary. And I think the reason for that is you can understand in the Occupy movements in a way. In a way, there was very little work to be done politically in the sense of political mutual enlightenment between the people who were there. They knew what the problem was. They weren't there because they had a question about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. They were there because they had views about capitalism. But the experience, as somebody remarked of this, was building the social. And it was largely building the social through what were activities of demonstration, discussions, to be sure. They were verbal. But these were dramatic events. The whole notion of being someplace where you don't belong is a kind of dramatic declaration. And my own experience about this is that in practice, a lot of it's not that anybody disagreed politically, but that the real work of making that goes on in movements like that is a work of making the social rather than certainly making a political party. At a more philosophical level, the problem I studied with him. We did not agree very much. I guess I could put it that way. I think the problem was that the move away for Hannah, the move away from the idea that the political realm was constituted by a disinvestment in identity, which is basically that's her phrase. You may not like it. That you didn't speak in the name of being black or white or woman or man. You spoke as a political subject. Was also a disinvestment in a lot of people's immediate material social experience. That's the difference between homo laborans and homo faber. And that extended to a kind of I would say decorporealization and dephysicalization of what she thought the political realm was about. I mean, we could argue about that. But I think my response to you would be about this, that we'd like everything to be negotiable with each other, and they could be. But my sense about how this works in making public space is that it tends inevitably to focus on the issue of making presence rather than on the issue of making, if you like, politics. It's a much more concrete, the task of making presence is something that can be organized visually, whereas the task of making politics is much more difficult to organize visually and physically. You may disagree, but that's my response to you. I mean, it's just a matter of experience that I've had in dealing with it. When we worked in Sarajevo, there was no way we could reconcile Muslims and Serbs. It's impossible. It wasn't worth trying. The war would start again. But we could take visual steps and urban design steps to get them to once again be in each other's physical presence. So that's how I think this falls out. Maybe it shouldn't, but I think that the designer, the architectural urban designer, is much more likely to be fulfilled trying to create presence than politics. I don't know what you feel about that.
Well, I would like to answer Bish's question and relate it to the other question. So, democracy and capitalism. So, once you get capitalism going around the world, there is no government large enough to hold it, right? The state, Massachusetts is too small, the nation's too small, the world, I mean, where are you located? I mean, it's hopeless, right? So, I actually think that we can empower local governments to change the nature of local capitalism, but we're empowering it in the opposite way. The greatest competition in America today is between local governments for capital money, much more than a competition between corporate enterprises. Everybody is competing against people in the same jurisdiction, the same region, to have the mall in their place, not the other place, and the corporation in their place, not the other place. And we've designed local government in this way to be disempowering. We could do better. We could do better. So I actually think that the political is the way to organize, the political, the democratic political, the non-property-based power needs to be organized to deal with it. Now, how do we do that? Then you think about where you vote. Where you vote. Very interesting question. Where do you live? If you answer that question, where you sleep, it's a very odd idea of living. I claim you are alive now. And yet, you may not sleep tonight in Cambridge. If you think about where people actually live, they live in several jurisdictions every day. Most people go from one place to another seamlessly. They shop in a third. Where do you live? So you could design a vote that took this into account. I've actually written a bunch about this, proposals to do just that. Think about one idea. Where do you want your children to go to school? Here is my proposal. Near work and not near home. Because you can drop them off on the way to work and pick them up on the way home. On the other hand, now, like the homeless woman and her children, you're not entitled to send your children to school because the way we've set up school districts, because you don't live there, although you spend more time there than you do. The rest of the time you're just sleeping, right? So redesigning the political to take on the idea of the lived experience of people and also capitalism, that's the project, it seems to me.
Okay, so we're running a little short on time, but why don't we take just 2 or 3 more questions and give the panelists one more opportunity, and then we'll shift gears slightly to a more general reflection on the day. So this is your chance. Yes, thank you in the back. We need to
wait for the microphone.
Hang on one second. We need to get you a mic.
If this was already brought up when I stepped out, I apologize, but I can think of a couple of examples of what could have been called boundaries that became borders. That is, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, a border that replaced the boundary that the John F. Fitzgerald Expressway made when it cut the waterfront off from the rest of Boston. And the High Line, which sort of like a created a shadow boundary between neighborhoods, but now because it's been greened, it's kind of more of a border that welcomes people from both neighborhoods into that central space. How successful do you think these boundaries that turned borders have been?
Great. Thank you very much. Have some confidence. And there's a hand on this side. Yep.
Could you discuss the use of walls in the form of apartheid-type governments, particularly, and also with Cold War, the demise of the Iron Curtain, like particularly with Berlin or other Iron Curtain countries?
Great. And let's take one more on this side.
What is with this place? Can't you ask me a simple question?
One more question, Richard.
Hi, I'm Kelli. I'm a student here. I had a question, or would like you to speak more about the economies of boundaries and borders, and how often the question of maintenance versus construction is apparent in it's cheaper to build a wall than it is to maintain a porous, fragile system. So how do we incentivize maintenance?
Great, thank you. Anything else for Jerry before we turn it back over to the panel? Since Richard has just been
I'll say something about walls.
You'll say something about that? Of course, actually, of course. Great, back to the panel then.
Go ahead.
The definition of private property, Felix Cohen, a legal scholar, said, is keep out. Private property. It's my property. Get out. Get it on. Now, we now organize a lot of cities that way. Not just gated communities, but also zoned suburbs, in which the whole idea of the way we're organizing is to keep out. You have no business here. This is our place, not your place. So we build walls to keep people out, and we build boundaries of jurisdictions to keep building out. We don't need a wall. We can do it just through the legal system.
I think you put your finger probably on the greatest issue that the corrective issue that we have to face in modern planning, which is how to turn cities that are boundaried into borders. And most cities don't have the financial resources, for instance, in dealing with traffic boundaries, to do what Boston did and do a big dig. And I gather Boston didn't have those resources either. So in Venezuela, for instance, in Caracas, which has a legacy of boundary use of transport, there's been a lot of work in the last decade about how to transform highways so that it's easier to cross them. In Colombia, my colleague Enrique Peñalosa in Bogota tried to get at this problem another way by essentially slowing down traffic to the point, and by constricting traffic to the point where the highway itself was colonized and became more quote-unquote inefficient. And those are much cheaper than the big dig. But the impulse in all of them is the same. These are much poorer countries, of course, but the impulse is the same, which is to address the fundamental condition of segregation, which is the use of motion to isolate people in space, which is, as you know, the big story of 20th century urbanism, that the privileging of motion became a way of isolating people in space. I've written a lot about that, and I'm very tempted to give you a 50-minute summary of that. Could I say something about walls, too? Walls are a rather ironical phenomenon. I once said this to a Palestinian friend of mine. If the Israelis were so foolish as to leave those so-called security walls up for 50 years, you would find that they would become zones of intense activity rather than the boundaries they are now. And what I meant by that, I mean, I think they're appalling and horrible, and they should be taken down tomorrow. But what I meant by that, in terms of the history of urban walls, is something that we've seen in Europe over and over again, and that has also appeared in some African cities, which is that the wall, which is meant as a protection against the outside, begins to function over long periods of time as a kind of space for exiles. In Avignon, for instance, it's where exiles, prostitutes, and Jews lived. The wall became the space for the gray economy. It became this peripheral space which developed its own life, the life that was not regulated or was condemned in the center. And this is a history of the morphology of these physical objects which has repeated itself in different places. Doesn't mean it has to always repeat. What it does draw our attention to is the notion of the idea of a gated community is a fantasy in the long term. What we know from the history of development is that eventually spaces which are meant to be places that don't matter are colonized by people who don't matter to the cities in which they live. And so it's a very funny urban form. You asked me about the economy of borders and boundaries, and that bears on it a little. Borderland spaces are spaces where, precisely because they're less regulated, there are spaces that peripheries tend to be spaces that are abandoned, that have very little value. That it's possible to do some kinds of activity that you couldn't do at a center, for instance. I'm no great specialist on this, but the observation I've had about it is that basically it's what we see in cities is that the places where innovation or development occurs, cultural, artistic, technical, tend to be spaces which are not dominated by a profitable capitalist center. They're abandoned spaces. They don't count. They're marginal. They're peripheral. And so, to me, as a planner, those are the spaces I want to work with. I don't want to make Wall Street a more perfect machine for Citibank. And that's an ignoble aspiration. How's that? I think as planners what we want to do is focus on those peripheral spaces which are more likely to be spaces that matter to people who need planning and need our skills.
So great. So I think we owe a round of applause. So it's been a long day. It's we have a huge number of topics on the table for discussion, and it's just wonderful that so many, like everyone, has stayed for the entire day. I mean, it's really a testament to the kind of intensity of the discussions, and perhaps it kind of strikes a chord of urgency in terms of a lot of issues that folks are trying to think through. So thanks to everyone for making this possible. We've got only a little bit of time left. I mean, I guess about 15 minutes or so. Maybe we can go over a bit, but it is getting quite late. So Moisen asked Diane and myself to make a few brief remarks to kind of get this rolling. But Moisen, is there anything you would like to say? I mean, you can just pass it over to us, but even I thought I'd give you the opportunity to say something before we do. At the end? Fine. And then we want to really open it up. I mean, I've got a few things. Diane, would you like to start?
Sure. I just have four short points. Hopefully, I'm no more than 5 minutes. I hope. I guess I want to just summarize what I think, or at least what stood out for me about what we've accomplished today, and also some things that maybe still remain to be addressed in next year's conference or whatever. The first one, kind of building on some of, especially on this last panel, I was madly scribbling about the day. I'm not listening as much as I should have, but in the Q&A, so some have been addressed. But first I was very inspired by the prior conversation about public space and the previous panel. But I think one thing to put on the table, and Richard has already kind of mentioned it in his comments, that it's really important to remember that public space is not political space, and that it's agency, action, human beings that turn a public space into a political space. So the small s public space is not the big P, the big, S public space or political space. So they get made through action. They're socially constructed. Now, yes, we've talked a lot today, and especially in the last panel, about the spatial elements become key in this process. But I think we have to remember Richard's point about the dialogic or the dialectic, and think more about how the kind of action in physical spaces makes them public or political. So with the exception, maybe, except of Gerald's wonderful presentation where we actually see the the phenomenology of what type of space becomes political, we really need to keep that in our radar screen here at the design school. I think the second comment I would say that I personally have come to the conclusion that we really need to problematize the concept of the public. What is the public? I mean, that came through to me in the prior panel to this. From my perspective, we cannot define it without reference to at least the private. It's a relational concept. And the problem sometimes with design, we think we can put a boundary around it, but it is really a relational concept, and we have to be vigilant analytically in thinking about its relationality. And I think in this panels today, we've talked about, there are a couple relationalities that we want to keep in mind. I mean, first, in relation to who or what, of course. It could be the public is always in relation to the private, but that's still open for question, right? Does it vary city by city? I was thinking about the Mumbai example with the Chicago examples. What is the public as a relational idea is different in different cities. Within a city itself, I'm thinking of a Jamaica Plain versus downtown Boston. Is the kind of relationality of the public different there on a street versus a plaza? On the border of an area as opposed to even different communities? And last, how does that relationality change over time? And that's where Liz's presentation and bringing us back historically, does the relationality of the public and what it's connected to, was it different in Boston in the 60s, in the 90s, and in the present? So that then my third point, building right on that, is I think it's time to move beyond the public-private divide in debates. Maybe that sounds retrograde, like moving backwards. I know we here, designers and planners, love the idea of public space, but I think that it hides a lot of ideologies. It obfuscates the reality of the relationalities, and it's analytically imprecise, as we've seen in the discussion today. So I would throw on the table some old, maybe dinosauric ideas of state, civil society, and market, which is just coming in now in this last panel, and to think a little more about the relationality of those three dimensions in physical spaces. So rather than a dyad, a triad. Obviously, they're in physical spaces. Those three elements, those domains, can be acting in what we call public spaces, but to look at them analytically rather than just getting lost in the morass of public space might move us forward. And that leads to my last comment, which is, I think the question for us is, in what ways is the visibility and power and hegemony of those three domains, the state, civil society, and the market, are the actors and institutions that create them, established by and even enabled or constrained by physical space? And conversely, how does physical space, or the identification with or use or control over territory, over physical space, give visibility and power to those domains? And that, I think, brings us back to the political, which is what we have all been here to hear about and think about. So the question is, who is being empowered by the physical spaces of the city, and who's not being empowered by the physical spaces of the city? And I hope that we can talk about that after today or through the halls of the GSD or in our next conference. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Diane. So I have 2 points to make, and I try to make them really fast or really concisely, because it's the end of the day. So one is about what Saskia Sassen calls the endogeneity trap, and the other is about coming back to some of these political questions. So it's a methodological point and a political point. The methodological point. So Saskia has this idea in her book, Territory, Authority, Rights, the endogeneity trap. So I'm always borrowing methodological maneuvers from Saskia. And it's basically trying to derive the properties of a particular spatial form, let's say the urban or the national, from processes that are internal to it. So her whole idea is to kind of open it up. In other words, you can't explain the urban just in terms of the urban. You've got to look at it in a multi-scalar way. You can't explain the national just in terms of the national. She does the same thing with regard to the global. So in a way, we've been kind of dealing with that same problem in the context of design. So an endogeneity trap in the realm of design would be to try to derive the kind of social dynamics of a physical space just from the design principles of it. So we need to, so we've been sort of trying to wrap our heads around that. So in other words, but you could flip it around. There might be something like an exogeneity trap. In other words, if you try to derive the sort of predictions or analyses of what's going on within a physical space from purely sort of social, political, legal dimensions. And in a way, we've been kind of trying to avoid both of those things in the different panels. So in other words, appreciating a kind of dialectic between both the appreciation of the fundamental importance of design principles in the built environment as having a real structuring impact, but at the same time looking at kind of broader social, political, economic dynamics. And I think from panel to panel we sort of maneuvered that divide in different ways, but it seems to me that's a methodological challenge which this conference in rather interesting ways kind of opens up. In other words, we don't want to just do kind of design analysis via an endogeneity approach, but nor do we want to do what so many social scientists do, which is just either not even think about it, or to the degree that one does, you just derive it from like a legal principle. So it seems to me that's part of, it's kind of a more general set of issues that we're trying to deal with in this school. Many challenges associated with that. And then finally, the political point. So I had this idea of a distinction between the design of democracy and democracy as a design problem, which could be a productive way of thinking about what we're doing here. So the design of democracy, you might even say the architecture of democracy, like a lot of times when the literature on post-state socialism, they sort of talk about institutional design. It's very interesting that they use this word design. But they mean it in a more sort of straightforward kind of political science sense of elections and voting and accountability and the drawing of jurisdictions. And that's obviously fundamental, as Jerry, I think, very passionately and eloquently brought home to us. So the design of democracy matters, and we have to deal with that, whether we're dealing with the design of the physical, the built environment or not. We have to really think fundamentally about what is the institutional design. But again, flip it around, and I think a lot of us in this room at this school are trying to deal with this. This came out in different ways in the different presentations. Democracy is also a design problem. In other words, it's spatialized at different scales and different sites, and we've covered a lot of different spatial zones and arenas, from monuments, neighborhoods, the public, cities, regions. and territories and so forth. And here's kind of just a kind of question that flows from that, also tying in with some of the earlier discussion. So in my kind of opening remarks, I was suggesting that democracy has traditionally been defined in terms of this territorial co-presence within a kind of Westphalian model and at a national scale, which involves a certain model of popular sovereignty based on kind of territorial co-presence. And I think a lot of the panels have suggested that that model has been decentered or undermined in different ways. I mean, again, Jerry's remarks suggest that it's been decentered in part through a kind of increasing assault on the accountability of public institutions. So the question that I would derive from that is, to what degree can kind of creative design, radical design, experimental design, and we had a number of different discussions and different sites during the course of today, provide actually some, not necessarily solutions, but maybe kind of, well, maybe solutions, but at least ideas, inroads, strategies for confronting that problematique. In other words, it doesn't solve the problem of the design of democracy. But on the other hand, to the degree that design can, through its interventions, through its experiments, through its visions, open up perspectives for democratic empowerment, maybe that provides an interesting counterpoint that can be built upon for purposes of institutional redesign. So at this point, I'm going to stop. It's now 5:58, but I believe if people still have it in you, that maybe we should, like my proposal, my design proposal for the next 10, 15 minutes, is maybe we should just, those of us who have already been on the panels, maybe we should just listen. Let's just pass the mic and just, if you could just make a comment. Yeah, or what? What? Just talk. Yeah, well, I think does it make sense to at least offer folks in the room an opportunity to publicly just make a few final comments, or do we want to just call it? I don't know how to democratically decide this. Maybe we just ask
our
Boyce.
dean.
What do you think, Boyce? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I agree. Christoph, there's a mic.
I need air.
I like to refer to Svetlana's comment. As an artist who done lots of work in public space, in lots of design as well. And I think that in order to create or live through those borders, we also might need equipment. So it's not only the issue of urban design or architectural design. If it's a graduate school of design, we should talk about design, meaning various kinds of design. People are wearing things, they are holding cell phones, they use communications, they act in a very performative and media kind of supported way. And maybe there is lots of design that could be done to live along those boundaries or move between different sides of the boundaries or even create the boundaries through design.
Other comments? Yes. Could you pass this across, please? Thank you.
I wanted to respond a bit to this question about markets, and thinking about Fernand Braudel's triple structure of markets, like non-market, market, and anti-market, and that somehow Occupy is a violent opposition, in a sense, to the anti-market. And I think for Braudel, the anti-market is there are markets that are somewhat normative and important to sociable life. And then the anti-market is a kind of collusion between state and financial capital and very large interests. So occupies that kind of resistance to that realm. And I think for that reason, it's very political. I guess I disagree with Richard Sennett that somehow Occupy is a social movement primarily. And I think it's a very anarchist political movement. It's highly organized. David Graeber has written about that. It's also very creative in its design, I think.
Right.
So I would like to argue that Occupy, in its opposition to both state and market, of a particular form, and I think that any modification of the state requires that external opposition. That has to do with civil society. But that it's highly political, it's anarchist, it's horizontal. The mic check is a kind of design structure for horizontality and for political decision making. But it's a very specific kind of politics. It's a non-representational politics. And so I think you were talking about anarchism earlier. You were talking about maybe a non-political anarchism. I'm not sure. But it seems to me it's a very anarchist politics.
No, fair enough. Fair enough.
Want to have the last word or two? Oh, yes, sorry.
Just a quick word from the last comment. Hi, my name's Kian. I'm a PhD student at MIT, and I want to sort of just not to problematize, but to take issue a little bit to constant references to Occupy Wall Street as part of a very monolithic set of social movements throughout the world. And I think, I love Occupy Wall Street as much as, well, not everyone, but most people. And I understand the real value that the unearthing of inequality in this country has, because I think it's a real issue. But I also want to caution against what I sense here last week at the AAG meeting. It's a sort of self-congratulatory fervor almost amongst the left, amongst the academic left for this Occupy movement. The fact that we love the fact that we're all in this 99%, when we're really, the 99% itself really needs to be taken apart a little bit. And I agree. I think, the Occupy movement, I think from a more superficial look, didn't need to do very much. They understood why they were there, right? But I would propose that if they had more of a political analysis from within the movement, that it could have done, it can still do the movement some good. Thanks.
Interesting.
Comment. This has been a wonderful conference. I've enjoyed it. I think it was Moisen, if I'm not mistaken, in introducing Saskia referred to Zimmel and Metropolis and mental life. And I'm struck that in terms of the design of the conference and a lot of the conversation, that the mental life part hasn't really been addressed. And if you think about some of the classic work on cities, whether it's Mumford, talked about the intellectualization, even Louis Wirth, who I think was wrong, but nonetheless talked about the effects of urbanization on individual alienation in the psyche. So I guess the question really is, has design, the school or the field, jettisoned social psychology?
Yes or no question? Final remarks. Gerald, I can tell you're just sorry.
You could put that much more positively. You would,
He's asking for more interaction.
yeah, which is to say that people like Zimmel imagined that place was a lifelong experience, and that the narrative of a life was shaped by the space of a place. And by not dealing with the developmental sciences, what we lose is, he had the wrong one, but the notion that life narratives intersect with the forms of place, and he could do that from birth to death. So put it more positively. Not what they lack, but what comes in the future.
I don't want to seem like the rude guest who puts his feet on the table, but
no.
But I want to second the cautioning about the great enthusiasm about the Occupy Wall Street. I think it's neither a social movement nor a political movement. It's a theatrical event. And it's a theatrical event that is taking place in a private space that has this very ambiguous status that is accessible to the public, but it's in fact managed by a private entity, and from which people were removed by the government in order to protect financial capitalism. And so one of the ways to look at this, I think in a more realistic way, is that financial capitalism can afford a lot of theatrical moments like that, so long as it doesn't connect with official politics. But of course the problem is that in order to connect with official politics, there has to be an opening. Official politics has to be not confiscated by the very powers whom it is supposed to tame. And I think that there's a need to go beyond the enthusiasm of the theatrical moment and to use the theatrical moment as precisely as a sort of dramaturgical scene that provides us with an idea of the severe obstacles that lay in reestablishing political rule over financial capital, which I think is the problem that is faced not only by America today, but by the European Union. And we're seeing this, now there's been 30 meetings of the European Union that are announced as the final resolution of the financial crisis of Greece and so on. And the incapacity of 20 countries, which cannot together take the minimal rules to bring down the very banks whom, parallel to that, they feed. Now we know that so I want to sound that note of caution, even as I like the theater of Occupy Wall Street.
Thank you, Louis. So I think on this note, it's time to conclude. I want to thank Moisen. I want to thank the GSD staff for putting this whole thing together, and I want to thank all of you for coming and making this such a lot, and all the participants, of course, for your contributions. And thanks to all of you for coming and making this such an incredibly stimulating afternoon and day. And the project will continue. Thank you very much.